The lawyer Michael looked up from the documents with a serious expression that sent a chill down my spine. He had just finished reading the main part of my husband's will, and my stepson Daniel couldn't contain his euphoria. He stood up as if he were the new king of an empire, adjusting the expensive suit I had bought him, not knowing he would use it to destroy me. "You all heard it," Daniel shouted with his arms outstretched, looking at my son David and his wife Sarah. "We get the house and the business. She only gets the plants." His laughter was so loud it echoed throughout the lawyer's office. Sarah covered her mouth, feigning surprise, but her eyes shone with pure malice. Even my own son David let out a nervous chuckle, as if he found it amusing that his 65-year-old mother was being left practically homeless. "The garden plants," Sarah repeated between bursts of laughter. "How generous of your stepfather, Daniel. He left her his beloved flowers to take care of in her old age." Everyone laughed as if it were the funniest joke in the world. I remained seated in silence, feeling tears welling up, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. Daniel approached my chair with that contemptuous smile I knew so well. "Oh, Emily, don't look so sad. At least you can sell some roses to buy bread." His comment provoked another wave of laughter. "Besides, it was about time someone young took over the business. You never understood any of it. You were always just the wife who served coffee to the customers." The lawyer Michael cleared his throat, and I noticed something strange in his expression. There was a tension in his eyes that wasn't there before. "Mr. Daniel," he said in a firm voice, "I'm afraid there's something important I must clarify before you continue celebrating." Daniel waved his hand dismissively. "What else could there be, Michael? We've heard everything." "My father left me the hardware store, the 2 commercial properties, and the family house. David gets the auto repair shop. And he pointed at me as if I were a stranger, gets her plants. It's all very clear and fair considering we were always the ones who worked hard while she stayed home playing in the garden." "Exactly," David chimed in for the first time, and his support for his stepbrother hurt more than any slap. "Daniel and I were always in the business with Dad. She only took care of domestic things." His wife Linda nodded from her chair as if it were the most sensible opinion in the world. Sarah stood up and walked over to me with a fake smile. "Don't worry, Emily. I'm sure you'll find a tiny apartment where you can put your flower pots. Maybe near the market so you can sell your flowers on weekends." Her tone was so condescending it made me clench my fists. "Ha, selling flowers at the market," Daniel scoffed. "Perfect for a woman who never knew how to do anything but water plants and cook. At least she'll be useful for something for the first time in her life." The lawyer Michael slammed his desk firmly, interrupting the cruel laughter. "Enough!" His voice cut through the air like a knife. "Before you continue with this celebration, I must inform you of some very important details that completely change the situation." Daniel looked at him with annoyance. "What details? You've already read the whole will." "There's nothing more to discuss." His arrogance made me sick, but something in the lawyer's expression made me sit up straight in my chair. Michael opened another folder that he had kept closed this whole time. "The businesses you believe you have inherited," he said slowly, "never belonged to you. They were registered in the name of—" The office fell completely silent. Michael kept that mysterious folder open in front of him, and I could see the smiles slowly fading from Daniel and Sarah's faces. David leaned forward confused, while Linda clung to his arm as if she sensed something terrible was about to happen. "In whose name?" Daniel asked, his voice no longer sounding as confident as before. His arrogance was starting to show cracks like a mask crumbling under pressure. The lawyer Michael looked directly at me before answering. "They were registered in the name of Mrs. Emily from the moment the companies were founded, 25 years ago." The world stopped for a moment. Daniel's jaw dropped, his face turning from absolute triumph to complete confusion. "That's impossible," he stammered. "My father always ran the businesses. He was the owner of everything. I worked with him for years. I know every customer, every supplier, every contract." "You worked with him, yes," Michael continued in a firm voice, "but under the direct supervision of the true owner. Your stepmother, Mrs. Emily, who for all these years decided to let her husband be the public face of the businesses while she managed the real operations from the shadows." Sarah shot up from her seat. "This has to be some kind of mistake, a sick joke. How is it possible that this woman who spends her time watering plants is the owner of 3 companies?" Her voice had become shrill, desperate. "It's no mistake," Michael replied, pulling a stack of documents from the folder. "I have all the incorporation papers, the deeds, the lease agreements for the properties, the business bank accounts, everything in the name of Emily Rodriguez. Your husband was listed only as an authorized administrator, never as the owner." David looked like he had been punched in the gut. But Dad always told us we were his partners, that one day we would inherit everything." Daniel practically lived at the hardware store. He knew all the customers by name. "I spent every afternoon at the auto repair shop learning the trade." "And you did indeed learn," Michael confirmed. "But you were working for your stepmother, not for yourselves. Every important decision, every major investment, every significant contract all went through Mrs. Emily's final approval. Your father simply carried out the orders she gave him." Daniel started pacing like a caged animal. "This can't be true. She never showed up at the businesses. She was always at home, cooking, cleaning, taking care of those damn plants." His voice broke on the last word, as if he finally understood something that terrified him. "Apparently," Michael said with an almost imperceptible smile, "you never wondered why your father always had to consult at home before making important decisions, or why he brought home entire folders every night, or why Mrs. Emily always knew exactly how much money was in the accounts without ever stepping foot in an office." Sarah lunged towards the lawyer's desk. "Show me those papers. This has to be a forgery. That old woman manipulated her husband into putting everything in her name." Her hands trembled as she tried to reach for the documents. "Ma'am, please control yourself," Michael warned, pulling the papers out of her reach. "These documents are over 2 decades old and are duly certified by a notary public. Furthermore, I have testimonies from bankers, corporate lawyers, and accountants who have worked directly with Mrs. Emily all these years." "Testimonies?" David asked in a trembling voice. "What testimonies?" Michael pulled out another folder even thicker than the last. "Mr. Adrian Mendoza, manager of Central Bank, confirms that Mrs. Emily personally visited the bank offices every Friday to review the account statements of the 3 companies. Mrs. Rosalia Vega, tax accountant, states that she received direct instructions from Mrs. Emily for every tax return and every audit. Engineer Daniel Herrera, who built the hardware store extensions, confirms that all contracts were negotiated and personally signed by Mrs. Emily." Daniel slumped into his chair. All the color had drained from his face. "But if she's the owner, why did my father promise us we would inherit everything? Why did he make us work like slaves for years if he knew nothing belonged to us?" The lawyer glanced at me before answering, as if asking for permission to reveal the next truth. I nodded slightly, knowing it was time for them to know the whole story. "Your father promised you something that wasn't his to give, because he hoped to convince his wife to change her will. He believed that if you proved to be hardworking and committed, she would eventually cede ownership of the businesses to you." Michael paused dramatically. "He was wrong." The lawyer. Michael's words fell on the office like a nuclear bomb. Daniel looked as if he had just been stabbed in the back. His breathing had become ragged and his hands were shaking visibly. Sarah had started to cry, not out of sadness but out of sheer impotent rage, the bitter tears that come when you realize you've lost something you thought was already yours. "You're lying," Daniel muttered, but his voice sounded hollow without conviction. "This is all a conspiracy. She manipulated my father, poisoned him against us." He turned to me with eyes full of pure hatred. "You witch, you brainwashed my father. You convinced him to betray his own children." David had fallen silent, processing the information as if it were an impossible mathematical equation. Linda watched him worriedly, probably mentally calculating how much money they had just lost. The silence stretched for long seconds until my son finally spoke. "Mom," David said in a broken voice, "is this true? Are you really the owner of everything? His eyes begged me to say no, to say it was all a cruel joke, for things to go back to how he thought they were 5 minutes ago. For the first time in the entire meeting, I decided to speak. My voice came out firmer than I expected, weighted with 25 years of silent decisions and invisible sacrifices. It's true, David. It was always true. Daniel exploded like a volcano. Liar. If you were the owner, you would have been at the offices. You would have made the important decisions. You wouldn't have stayed at home like a servant. His face had turned red with anger, the veins in his neck bulging like taut ropes. You think I didn't make the important decisions? I asked with a calmness that surprised even me. Who do you think decided to hire Roberto as the foreman at the shop when you wanted to fire him, who authorized the purchase of that new machinery for the hardware store last year, who approved the pay raise for all employees in December? My father decided that, Daniel shouted, but his voice no longer sounded so sure. Your father came home every night with a folder full of pending decisions. I continued feeling the truth pour out of me like water from a spring. He would sit with me in the kitchen, and we would go over every contract, every investment, every problem with employees or suppliers. I reviewed the numbers, analyzed the projections, and made the final decisions. He would go back the next day and carry out my orders. Sarah wiped her tears away angrily. That's impossible. You know nothing about business. You're just a housewife. Her contempt dripped like poison. Michael intervened, opening another file. Allow me to clarify something about Mrs. Emily's education. She has a degree in business administration from the National University, graduated with honors in 1978. She worked for 5 years as an auditor at an accounting firm before getting married. She also has a specialization in corporate finance that she completed through distance learning during the first few years of her marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in his life. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Linda had turned pale, mentally calculating how many years they had completely underestimated the woman in front of them. But if you're so smart, why did you stay home? David asked in the voice of a lost child. Why didn't you work directly in the companies? The question hurt more than I expected, because it touched the deepest wound of my adult life. Because your father asked me to, I answered with brutal honesty. When we got married, he had just inherited a small auto repair shop from his father. He had big dreams, but zero business knowledge. He asked me to help him expand the business, but from home, because he believed customers wouldn't take a company run by a woman seriously. That was different back then, Linda muttered more to herself than to anyone else. It was 1985. I continued feeling decades of bitterness rise in my throat. The prejudice was stronger, it's true. But it was also easier for me to hide behind him and manage everything from the shadows. The customers saw a reliable man in charge, but every strategic decision came from me. Every expansion, every new product line, every business alliance, it all came from this head that you all thought was only good for planning menus and watering plants. Daniel stood up, staggering like a boxer who had just taken a devastating blow. No. This can't be happening. I dedicated my entire life to those businesses. I sacrificed my own dreams to build something I thought would be mine. His voice broke into a choked sob. Your own dreams? I asked with a bitter laugh. You mean your dream of showing up at 10 in the morning, taking a 2-hour lunch, and disappearing on Friday afternoons to drink with your friends? Or are you talking about your dream of collecting a salary every month without checking a single account, without worrying about overdue bills, without losing sleep over the competition across the street? I worked hard, Daniel protested, but even he knew his words sounded hollow. You worked the bare minimum, I corrected him. And every time there was a tough decision to make, every time a real problem came up, you came running home to your father. What do we do about the supplier who isn't delivering? Should we fire Lopez? Should we invest in that new product line? And your father would come up to my office, consult with me, come down with the answer, and you thought the wisdom came from him. Michael cleared his throat gently. Mrs. Emily, if I may, there's something else I must reveal about the true circumstances of this inheritance. His tone had changed, becoming more formal, more legal. All eyes turned to him. Daniel gripped the back of his chair as if it were the only thing holding him up. "What else?" he asked hoarsely. "The will you just heard was indeed your father's wish. But there is a detail that changes the entire picture." Michael pulled out a different document with official seals that gleamed under the office light. 3 days before his death, your father signed a codicil, a legal addition to the original will. "A codicil," Sarah repeated, saying the word as if it were poison. "In that codicil, your father officially acknowledges that all the assets mentioned in the original will never legally belong to him. He acknowledges that for years he acted as an administrator of someone else's property, specifically property belonging to his wife. And more importantly, he declares that any debt, mortgage, or financial problem associated with said businesses is the sole responsibility of those who inherit them in the original will." Daniel's face went from red to a deathly white in a matter of seconds. "Debts. What debts?" Michael smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a shark that smells blood in the water. "I'm glad you asked Daniel, because it turns out there are a few outstanding accounts that you will have to personally assume." Michael opened a new folder, this one red, as if the color itself warned of the danger within. Daniel had gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white as paper, while Sarah looked like she was about to faint. David was looking back and forth between the lawyer and me, as if trying to understand a completely foreign language. "The debts," Michael began in a measured voice, "are all documented here. Let's start with the most recent ones." He pulled out a sheet with a bank letterhead. "Daniel, do you remember when you requested that $50,000 loan last year to modernize the hardware store?" Daniel was speechless. Sarah looked at him with eyes of absolute panic. $50,000, she whispered. "You told me it was only $10,000 for some new tools." "The loan was approved using the hardware store as collateral," Michael continued relentlessly. "But since the hardware store never belonged to you, you technically committed bank fraud. However, the bank is willing to not press criminal charges if you take full responsibility for the debt plus accrued interest. Current total $67,400. "That's impossible," Daniel shouted. "My father signed those papers with me. He co-signed the loan." "Your father couldn't co-sign for something he didn't own," I explained with a surprising calm. "I never authorized that loan. In fact, I was strongly against it when your father consulted me about it." "But you insisted, you begged, you even threatened to leave the company if he didn't let you do it." Sarah staggered to her feet. "Daniel, you promised me that money was for the business." "Where is it? What did you spend it on?" Her voice had become hysterical. Daniel avoided her gaze. The silence stretched for long seconds until Michael decided to continue his devastating revelation. "According to bank records, $25,000 were spent on a sports car, $15,000 on a vacation in Europe, $8,000 on jewelry and luxury clothing, and the rest, well, it seems it was lost at a poker table in Atlantic City." "Lies!" Daniel roared, but his voice broke at the end of the word. Sarah slapped him so hard the sound echoed through the office like a gunshot. "You're a liar, a thief. You gambled away our family's future." Tears streamed down her face, but now they were tears of pure hatred for her own husband. David was frozen, watching his stepbrother fall apart before his eyes. "Daniel," he murmured, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't gamble away the business's money." But Daniel could no longer lie. His mask of a successful, confident man had shattered. "It was an investment," he stammered. "I was going to double the money and pay it back before anyone noticed. I had a system, a surefire strategy." "A system," Sarah scoffed. "Sarah. Your system was betting it all on black at the roulette table. Roberto from the shop told me everything. He saw you lose $25,000 in a single night." Michael cleared his throat to regain their attention. "Unfortunately, that's not all. David, you also have some outstanding debts." My son turned pale. "Me? But I never took out any loans. I was always responsible with the shop's money." "You're right that you never took out a formal loan," Michael confirmed. But you did authorize several large purchases without consulting the true owner: the new hydraulic lift, the advanced welding equipment, the computerized diagnostic system. Total $32,000 charged to the shop's accounts without Mrs. Emily's authorization. But those were necessary tools for the job, David protested. Dad told me to buy them, that they were important investments to keep the shop competitive. And they were indeed necessary, I acknowledged. But you never consulted me. Your father made those decisions unilaterally, hoping I would accept them after the fact. The difference is that you, David, at least bought useful things for the business. Your stepbrother spent the money on his personal lifestyle. Linda finally spoke, her voice trembling with terror. David, does this mean we have to pay back $32,000? Where are we going to get that kind of money? We just bought the new house. We have the mortgage, the car payments. Michael consulted another document. Ah, yes, the new house. Interesting topic. His smile turned even crueler. Did you know that the down payment for that house was paid with an advance from the shop's profits, an advance that was never authorized by the real owner? How much was the down payment? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. $45,000, Michael replied. Money that was taken from the auto shop's reserve accounts for emergency expenses. Apparently, David considered buying a 4-bedroom house with a pool to be an emergency. David collapsed into his chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Dad told me it was okay, that it was my money, that I had earned it working at the shop for years. He never told me I needed anyone else's authorization. Your father told you a lot of things, I murmured, feeling a mix of sadness and anger toward my late husband. He promised you a future that wasn't his to give, encouraged you to spend money that wasn't yours, made you believe you were owners of something that was always mine. Sarah had started to hyperventilate. We can't pay all of that. It's impossible. It's more than $100,000 between the two debts. We'd have to sell the house, the cars, everything we own. Exactly, Michael confirmed with professional satisfaction. And even then it wouldn't be enough to cover the total, because there are more debts to review. Daniel lifted his head like a wounded animal. More debts? How many more? Michael took out a calculator and began adding numbers as he spoke. The corporate credit cards you used for personal expenses. The salary advances you self-approved without authorization. The loans from petty cash that you never paid back. The commissions you paid yourselves for sales that never happened. His calculator beeped softly as the numbers added up. What's the total? David asked in the voice of a man condemned. Michael looked at the calculator screen and smiled. $187, $422.68, plus the interest that continues to accrue daily, of course. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Daniel had started to cry silently. Tears of absolute defeat streamed down his cheeks, and he didn't try to stop them. Sarah looked at him with total disgust, as if he were a repulsive stranger. David had his head in his hands, muttering numbers over and over like a desperate prayer. We don't have that money, Linda whispered. We don't have half that money. Not even if we sell everything we own could we pay those debts. I know, I said finally. And that is exactly why my husband decided to leave you those responsibilities in his will. He knew you had been spending money that didn't belong to you. He knew you had irresponsibly accumulated debts, and he decided it was only fair that you face the consequences of your own actions. Michael closed the red folder with a sharp snap that sounded like a judge's gavel. Gentlemen, you have 30 days to present an acceptable payment plan to the creditors, or we will proceed with the seizure of all your personal assets. Daniel had gotten to his feet like a zombie pacing the office and muttering numbers and dates like a madman. 30 days, he repeated over and over. $187,000 in 30 days. His expensive suit now looked wrinkled and soaked with sweat, as if he'd been working under the sun for hours. Sarah had stopped crying and was now looking at him with a blood-chilling coldness. Do you know what this means, Daniel? It means we're going to lose everything. The house, the cars, the jewelry, everything I worked for years while you played at being the great businessman. Her voice was pure, concentrated venom. There has to be a solution. David mumbled, still holding his head in his hands. "We can't just accept that it's all over. There has to be some way to fix this." He turned to me with pleading eyes. "Mom, you can help us. You can forgive the debts. You can make this all go away. We're family." The word family hit me like a slap. "Family," I repeated slowly. "Like when you were laughing at me half an hour ago, like when Daniel called me useless, like when Sarah suggested I go sell flowers at the market, that kind of family." Linda approached my chair and knelt beside me, taking my hands in hers. "Emily, please. David never meant to hurt you. He was just following Daniel's lead. He thought that's how things were. He never knew you were the real owner of everything." Her tears seemed genuine, but I had learned to distrust tears. David had 25 years to wonder why his mother never received any respect in her own house. I replied, pulling my hands away from hers. 25 years to notice that every important decision was consulted with me before it was executed. 25 years to realize that I knew every number, every client, every business problem better than anyone else. Michael had been watching this exchange with professional interest, but now he decided to intervene again. "Mrs. Emily, if I may, there is another aspect of the inheritance that we have not yet discussed, the famous plants your husband left you." All eyes turned to him. Even Daniel stopped pacing to pay attention. "What about the plants?" Sarah asked contemptuously. "Are the begonias going to pay our debts?" Michael smiled and pulled out another folder, this one green. "They're not exactly begonias, Mrs. Sarah. Could you tell me what you know about the Nursery Secret Gardens?" David frowned. "It's that huge place about 20 minutes from here. They sell ornamental plants and do landscape design for rich houses. Why do you ask?" "Because Secret Gardens is owned by Mrs. Emily. It has been for the last 15 years, Michael announced with evident satisfaction. The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't just shock or confusion. It was the silence of people who finally understand they have completely underestimated someone for decades. "That's impossible," Daniel stammered. "Secret Gardens is a multi-million-dollar company. They have contracts with luxury hotels with corporations. They even designed the gardens for the new shopping mall. It can't be owned by the woman you thought only knew how to water pots." I finished the sentence for him. "By the woman who, according to you, never did anything useful in her life." Michael opened the green folder and began to read. Secret Gardens was founded in 2009 by Mrs. Emily, initially as a small ornamental plant venture. For the first few years, it operated out of her own garden, selling flowers and decorative arrangements to neighbors and acquaintances. Gradually, she expanded the business, buying additional land hiring specialists in botany and landscaping, and establishing contracts with international suppliers. Sarah had turned so pale, she looked like a ghost. "But how, when we never saw you leave the house to work on something like that?" "Because you never paid attention," I told them with a calmness that surprised me. "You thought my morning walks were exercise for an old woman. You thought my gardening meetings with friends were just unimportant chats. You assumed that when I disappeared on Saturday mornings, I was going shopping at the market. Actually," Michael continued, "Mrs. Emily regularly visited the Secret Gardens grounds, personally supervised the crops, negotiated major contracts, and managed a team of 32 specialized employees." David's mouth was hanging open. 32 employees. "But Mom, why did you never tell us? Why did you keep all this a secret?" The question hurt because it touched the core of my most difficult decision. Because every time I mentioned a business idea, you laughed. When I suggested we could diversify into the agricultural sector, Daniel said that gardening fantasies were for bored women. When I proposed investing in landscape design, David said that wasn't a serious job for someone my age. Linda had stood up and was now pacing nervously. How much is Secret Gardens worth?" Michael consulted another document. According to the most recent valuation conducted last month by an independent firm, the total value of the company, including land inventory, current contracts, and projected future earnings, is approximately $2,400,000. Daniel collapsed into his chair as if he'd been shot. $2,400,000, he whispered. My whole life, working at the hardware store for a miserable salary, going into debt to maintain a lifestyle I thought I deserved while she was a millionaire. She wasn't just a millionaire, Michael added with obvious pleasure. She is a millionaire. And unlike you, she built her fortune honestly, without debt, without fraud, without gambling other people's money in casinos. Sarah had started pounding the desk with her fists. This isn't fair. If you had so much money, why did you let us get into debt? Why didn't you help us when we needed the loan for the hardware store? I did help you, I replied with a cold smile. I told you not to take out that loan. I warned you it was a bad decision. I offered you more conservative alternatives to improve the businesses. You chose to ignore my advice because it came from the woman who only understands plants. Michael pulled another document from the green folder. In fact, there are records of at least 12 occasions in the last 5 years where Mrs. Emily proposed specific investment plans that would have avoided all these debts. Her proposals were systematically rejected for being unrealistic or too complicated. David had stood up and walked to the window, looking out as if searching for answers in the sky. I don't understand, he murmured. If you were so successful, if you had so much money, why did you keep living like a normal housewife? Why didn't you ever show us your real success? The question forced me to face truths I had been avoiding for years. Because I was afraid, I finally admitted. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would constantly ask me for money. Afraid that my success would become your excuse to work less, to be less responsible. And I was right, wasn't I? As soon as you found out there was money available, the first thing you did was take out irresponsible loans. Daniel raised his head, his eyes bloodshot. You could save us, he said hoarsely. You have more than enough money to pay all our debts and still be rich. You could do it and never even notice. I could, I confirmed, but I won't. The 4 words I had spoken fell upon the office like a death sentence. But I won't. Daniel looked at me as if I had just transformed into a monster before his very eyes. Sarah had started sobbing hysterically, not from sadness, but from pure desperation. David turned from the window, his face a mask of total disbelief. How can you say that? David asked, his voice breaking. We're your family. I'm your son. Are you going to let us lose everything out of pride for revenge? It's not revenge, I replied with a calm I struggled to maintain. It's justice. For 25 years, you treated me as if I were invisible, as if my opinions didn't matter, as if my only function was to serve coffee and clean up your messes. Now that you find out who I really am, you want me to rescue you from the consequences of your own decisions. Daniel staggered to his feet. His face had taken on a sickly grayish hue. Emily, please, I can change. I can be different. I can work hard. I can pay you back every cent. I can... His voice broke into a pathetic sob. Like you worked hard when you stayed home sick 3 days last week to watch the football games, I asked with calculated cruelty. Or like when you told your father that the Gonzalez client had canceled his order, when in reality you never called him because you were too busy playing online poker. Sarah looked at me with pure hatred. How do you know all that? Have you been spying on us like some gossipy old woman? Michael intervened before I could answer. Mrs. Emily received detailed reports from all employees about the behavior of her managers. Roberto from the shop, Maria from the hardware store, even the suppliers regularly informed her about Daniel and David's activities. Reports? Linda asked, her voice trembling. The employees were watching us. The employees were reporting to their real boss, I corrected her. I paid their salaries, I authorized their vacations, I decided their raises. Of course, they kept me informed about what was happening in my own companies. I paused and smiled coldly. You thought that because your father signed the checks, he was the one making the decisions. How naive. David approached my chair, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I understand you're angry. I understand we made mistakes, but punishing us like this isn't going to fix anything. Linda and I have a mortgage to pay. We have expenses. We have plans for the future." "Plans you made without consulting me," I reminded him. "Like when you decided to buy that $400,000 house without asking me if it was wise. Like when Linda quit her job because the family had enough money. Those plans." Linda had turned red with shame. "We thought David was a co-owner of the shop. We thought we had financial security. We never would have made those decisions if we had known the truth." "Exactly," I said with satisfaction. "You never would have made those decisions if you had known you depended on my authorization. You would have been more careful, more respectful, more humble, but you preferred to assume you deserved everything without earning it." Michael had been watching this exchange with professional fascination, but now he decided to add more fuel to the fire. "Mrs. Emily, would you like me to reveal the details about your other company?" Daniel lifted his head like a wounded animal. "Another company? How many more do you have?" Secret Gardens was just the beginning. I confessed feeling the power of the truth fill me with energy. 5 years ago, I decided to diversify my investments. "Michael, please tell them about Green Distributors." Michael opened a new folder, this one gold-colored. Green Distributors is an import-export company for agricultural products specializing in exotic ornamental plants. It was established by Mrs. Emily as a natural expansion of Secret Gardens. It currently has contracts with suppliers in Colombia, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala. Sarah had stopped crying and was now looking at me with a mixture of terror and involuntary respect. "International import. How did you learn to do that?" "I learned," I said simply. "While you thought my computer was only for cooking recipes, I was taking online courses in international trade. While you thought my phone calls were for gossiping with friends, I was negotiating contracts with Central American exporters. While you assumed I didn't understand technology, I was developing a digital platform for selling ornamental plants." David had sat down on the floor, literally collapsed. "I can't process it," he murmured. "All this time living with you, seeing how you lived, and we never ever suspected a thing." "Because you never asked me," I reminded them harshly. "When I disappeared for hours, you assumed I was at the grocery store. When I received strange packages, you thought they were household purchases. When I had meetings on weekends, you thought they were unimportant social activities. You never bothered to ask what I was really doing with my time." Michael consulted the golden document. "The current value of Green Distributors, including inventory active contracts and accounts receivable, is approximately $800,000. Projections for the next year suggest a 30% growth." Daniel had stood up and was now punching the wall with his fist. $3 million! You have over $3 million, and you're going to let us sink for less than $200,000. His voice had become high-pitched, desperate. "I'm not going to let you sink," I corrected him. "You sank yourselves. I simply refuse to pull you out of the hole you dug with your own hands." Sarah had approached me, her eyes glistening with tears and rage. "Do you know what this means for us? Do you know we're going to lose our house, that our children will have to change schools, that Daniel will be marked as a debtor at every bank?" "I know exactly what it means," I replied without flinching. "It means you're going to experience what it's like to live with the consequences of your actions. It means you're going to learn what financial responsibility is. It means you're going to understand the real value of money." Linda had knelt beside my chair again. "Emily, please think of the children. David and I have 2 young kids. They don't deserve to suffer for their parents' mistakes." Her tears seemed genuine, but I had developed an immunity to manipulative tears. "The children won't suffer," I assured them. "They will learn important values. They will understand that money is earned through hard work, not undeserved inheritances. They will see that actions have consequences. It will be the best education they could possibly receive." Michael had been taking notes throughout this entire exchange. "Mrs. Emily, there is one last legal detail I must mention. Regarding the settlement of the outstanding debts." They all turned to him with a mixture of hope and terror. "What detail?" David asked. "As you cannot pay the debts incurred using the companies as collateral, and as those companies never legally belong to you, there is a possibility of negotiating a settlement with the creditors." Michael paused dramatically. "A settlement that would require the participation of the true owner of the assets." Daniel lunged towards the desk. "That means Emily can help us. She can negotiate with the banks. She can fix all this." "I can," I confirmed slowly. "But my negotiation services are not free." The expression on Daniel's and David's faces changed instantly when I spoke those last words. Desperation mingled with a new understanding. They finally grasped that I held all the power in this situation, and I wasn't going to use it without demanding something in return. "What do you mean they're not free?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "You're going to charge us for helping your own family." "I'm going to charge the people who for 25 years treated me like their servant," I corrected her coldly. "The people who mocked me, who despised me, who assumed I was good for nothing but cleaning and cooking. Yes, I'm going to charge you dearly." Michael leaned back in his chair, obviously enjoying the show. "What are your terms, Mrs. Emily?" I had been waiting for this moment for years, mentally planning what I would say if I ever got the chance to completely turn the tables. "My terms are simple." I began savoring each word. "I can negotiate with the banks to reduce your debts to approximately $50,000 in total payable over 5 years without interest." David sat up straight, as if he'd received an electric shock. $50,000 instead of $187,000, is that even possible? It's possible when you have the right connections, the necessary experience, and the financial backing to guarantee the payments, I explained, things you never had because you were too busy playing at being important. Daniel had clung to this new hope like a drowning man clings to a life raft. I accept any condition you set. Make the negotiation." I haven't finished explaining my conditions. I interrupted him with a smile that should have been a warning. "The debt reduction is only the first term. The second is that both you and David will work for me in my companies, earning exactly the legal minimum wage." Sarah turned pale. "Minimum wage? But that's impossible. They can't support their families on minimum wage." "They'll have to learn how," I replied without sympathy. "Millions of people manage it every day. It will be a very valuable educational experience for men who never knew the real value of money." Linda had stood up, pacing nervously back and forth. "For how long?" "A year? 2 years. Until you finish paying off the $50,000, I replied. "Considering you'll be earning minimum wage and have family expenses, I estimate it will be about 8 years. David's jaw dropped. 8 years earning minimum wage. "But I have experience. I know how to run the auto shop. I can earn much more anywhere else." "You can try," I said with a cruel smile. "But I'll remind you that you have a $187,000 debt that will appear on your credit history. Do you think any employer will want to hire someone with that financial burden? Do you think any bank will give you a loan to start your own business?" Michael had been taking meticulous notes. "In fact, the outstanding debts have already been reported to the credit agencies. Your credit scores have dropped to levels that practically guarantee you won't be able to get a job in a position of financial responsibility." Daniel slumped back into his chair. "You have us completely trapped," he muttered. "We have no alternative." "You have an alternative," I corrected him. "You can refuse my offer and face the consequences of your debts alone. You can declare bankruptcy, lose all your possessions, and start from scratch with no help from anyone." "It's your decision." Sarah had started crying again, but now they were tears of absolute defeat. "And what's the third term? Because I'm sure there are more humiliating conditions waiting." "There is indeed a third condition," I confirmed. "For those 8 years, you will live in the house where I always lived. The house that you considered too modest for your high standards. You will sell your current houses. You will get rid of your luxury cars. You will cancel your memberships to exclusive clubs." Linda had turned pale. "We're all going to live in the same house, the 2 families together." "Exactly," I replied with satisfaction. You will experience what it means to live on a limited budget without unnecessary luxuries depending on a single person for important decisions. You will understand how I felt for 25 years. David had stood up and was now hitting his forehead with the palm of his hand. This is a nightmare. It has to be a nightmare. This can't really be happening. It's very real, I assured him. And there is a fourth condition I haven't mentioned yet. Daniel lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. A fourth condition. What more can you take from us? Our kidneys. The fourth condition, I continued relentlessly, is that every day before you start work, you will report to my office and publicly apologize for every insult, every taunt, every moment of contempt you made me endure for all those years. Sarah stood up screaming. That's humiliating. That's cruel. You can't force us to do something like that. I'm not forcing you, I reminded her calmly. I'm offering you a chance to save yourselves from the financial disaster you created. If you prefer bankruptcy and total ruin, you are free to reject my terms. Michael cleared his throat. Mrs. Emily, are there any additional conditions I should include in the contract? Yes, I replied, savoring the final moment. The fifth and final condition is that every dollar you pay me during those 8 years will be considered a personal loan that I am granting you to save your financial lives. When you finish paying off the reduced debt, you will owe me a favor equivalent to the total value of my help. David had sat down on the floor again, completely defeated. What kind of favor? The favor I deem appropriate at that time, I replied with a mysterious smile. It could be working for free in my companies for an additional year. It could be donating your time to charities of my choosing. It could simply be publicly acknowledging that a woman you despised saved you from total ruin. Daniel had started laughing hysterically, a bitter, desperate laugh. It's perfect, he muttered between laughs. It's absolutely perfect. The woman we thought was useless turns out to be smarter, richer, and more powerful than all of us combined. And now she's going to be our boss for the next 8 years. At least you finally understand the situation correctly, I told him coldly. Linda had approached the window and was looking out as if searching for an escape route. And if we refuse all the conditions? What happens then? Michael answered before I could. Then you face legal action for a total of $187,400 plus interest and legal costs, seizure of all your assets, possible prison time for Daniel due to bank fraud, complete destruction of your credit histories, and of course no help from Mrs. Emily to rebuild your lives. Sarah turned from the window. Her face was a mask of absolute defeat. We have no choice, do we? It's either accept your elegant revenge or lose everything in the most humiliating way possible. It's not revenge, I corrected her once more. It's poetic justice. For 25 years you had all the power and treated me like trash. Now I have all the power, and you are going to experience what it means to be completely dependent on someone else's benevolence. Do we have time to think about it? David asked in the voice of a scared child. You have exactly 5 minutes, I replied, checking my watch. After that, the offer automatically gets worse, and the conditions become less favorable for you. The 5 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. The ticking of the lawyer Michael's wall clock echoed like hammer blows in the tense silence of the office. Daniel had started pacing in circles again, muttering numbers and dates like a desperate prayer. Sarah sat with her head in her hands, sobbing quietly. David looked back and forth between his wife Linda and me, as if waiting for someone to tell him it was all a cruel joke. 4 minutes, I announced without looking up from my watch. Linda went over to David and whispered something in his ear. He shook his head violently, but she insisted, squeezing his arm in desperation. I could catch fragments of their conversation. The children. School. We have no choice. Sarah suddenly lifted her head, her red, swollen eyes looking at me with a mixture of hatred and supplication. Is this what you really want, Emily, to see us humiliated for 8 years? Is that going to make you happy? It's not about happiness, I replied with brutal honesty. It's about balance. For 25 years you were happy at the expense of my dignity. Now you will restore that dignity with your forced humility. It's simple math. Daniel stopped in front of me, his face drenched in sweat and tears. Emily, please. I know I was a terrible son to you. I know I treated you badly, that I didn't respect you, that I made you feel invisible. But I can change. Give me a chance to show you I can be different without having to go through this humiliation. You had 25 years of chances, I reminded him without flinching. Every day you chose to ignore me, every moment you treated me like your personal servant, every time you mocked my opinions was a chance to be different. You didn't take it then. Why should I believe you now? Michael cleared his throat gently. 3 minutes remaining, he announced in a neutral voice, but I could see a glint of amusement in his eyes. He was clearly enjoying this moment as much as I was. David stood up abruptly and approached my chair. Mom, I accept. I accept all your conditions. His voice trembled, but there was a desperate determination in it. Linda is pregnant. We just found out last week. We can't risk losing everything now. The pregnancy revelation fell on the office like an additional bomb. Linda turned red and began to cry harder. Daniel looked at her in absolute surprise. Even I was momentarily moved, but I quickly regained my composure. Congratulations, I said in a neutral voice. One more baby who will learn the value of hard work and financial responsibility from a young age. It will be a wonderful gift. Linda approached me, her hands on her still flat stomach. Emily, please, if not for us, do it for your grandchild on the way. He doesn't deserve to grow up in poverty because of his parents' mistakes. He's not going to grow up in poverty, I reassured her. He's going to grow up in a family that finally understands the real value of money. He'll have parents who know what it means to work for every cent. He'll be much more fortunate than children who grow up believing everything should be handed to them on a silver platter. Daniel had been staring at Linda with a strange expression. How long have you known you were pregnant? He asked her. For 2 weeks, she admitted between sobs. I was going to tell David after the will reading when we thought we would be celebrating our new wealth. 2 minutes, I announced, checking my watch again. Sarah stood up abruptly and planted herself in front of me with her arms crossed. Fine, Emily, you win. I accept your humiliating conditions, but I want you to know that this will destroy any chance of us ever having a real relationship as a family. What relationship? I asked. The relationship where I only existed to serve you. Is that the relationship you think we're going to lose? Daniel had approached Michael's desk, visibly trembling. I accept too, he muttered. I accept all the conditions. I have no choice. Michael began to pull documents from another folder. Excellent, I have the contracts ready here. You just need to sign and you will be legally bound to comply with all the agreed-upon terms. You already had the contracts ready? David asked in surprise. Mrs. Emily instructed me to prepare them last week, Michael confirmed with a smile. She anticipated exactly how this meeting would unfold. Daniel looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration and terror. You planned everything, didn't you? Every detail of this humiliation was calculated from the beginning. From the day your father died, and I knew you thought you were going to inherit my companies, I confirmed. Every document, every revelation, every moment of shock you experienced today was all carefully orchestrated. Sarah had picked up one of the contracts and was reading it with a look of growing horror. This is more detailed than I thought, she muttered. It says here we have to ask for permission for any purchase over $50, that our salaries will be deposited directly into an account that you control, that any violation of the rules results in additional financial penalties. It also says, I added with satisfaction, that any disrespect towards me, any derogatory comment, any attempt to sabotage my businesses will result in the immediate cancellation of the agreement and the return to the full original debts. Linda had begun reading over Sarah's shoulder. It says here we have to hand over our cell phones and computers for you to check our communications. I need to make sure you're not conspiring against me or leaking confidential information from my companies. I explained with relentless logic. You are entry-level employees, now you have no right to corporate privacy. David had taken his own contract and was reading it with growing desperation. It says here, our work hours will be from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. 6 days a week. That's a very reasonable schedule for employees who need to pay off significant debts, I replied. Many people work much longer hours for much less money. Daniel had found a particularly cruel clause. We are forbidden from drinking alcohol for the 8 years of the contract. Alcohol clouds judgment, I explained. And you've already proven to have very poor judgment when you were sober. I can't risk it getting worse with alcohol involved. Michael had spread several pens on his desk. If you're going to sign, I need you to do it now. In 30 seconds, the offer is automatically reduced according to Mrs. Emily's instructions. Sarah was the first to pick up a pen. Her hands were shaking so much she could barely hold it. This feels like selling my soul to the devil, she muttered as she signed. The devil would have offered you much worse terms, I assured her with an icy smile. Daniel signed next. Each letter of his name looked like a stab into the paper. David was the last looking at me one more time with pleading eyes before putting his signature down. Linda didn't need to sign since she hadn't technically incurred any debt, but Michael handed her an additional document. This is a cohabitation agreement, he explained. It sets the rules for living in Mrs. Emily's house. When they had all finished signing the documents, Michael organized them neatly into a new folder. Perfect, he announced. The contracts are now legally binding. Your new positions will begin on Monday at 6 a.m. sharp. Daniel had collapsed into his chair, completely defeated. So now what? We go home and pack up our lives. Now, I said, standing up for the first time in the entire meeting, you are going to experience what it means to be treated exactly as you treated me for 25 years. You're going to find out what it feels like to be invisible, to be despised, to be considered less important than the furniture. So, I walked to the door, but stopped and turned one last time. The difference is, you deserve this treatment. I never did. 6 months later, as I sat in my new executive office in the Secret Gardens corporate building, I watched through the window as Daniel carried heavy pots in the morning rain. His expensive suit had been replaced by a soaked work uniform. His once soft hands were now calloused and dirty. At 6 a.m. sharp, just like every day for the past 6 months, he had appeared in my office to fulfill the 4th condition of our contract. Good morning, Mrs. Emily, he had said with his head bowed. I am here to apologize for saying you were only good for watering plants. I apologize for treating you as if you were invisible. I apologize for wasting your company's money on gambling and personal luxuries. The words came out of his mouth as if they were stones that hurt him to speak. David had arrived 5 minutes later, equally soaked, equally humiliated. Good morning, Mrs. Emily, he repeated the daily ritual. I apologize for assuming my merits entitled me to your property. I apologize for not defending you when others mistreated you. I apologize for spending money that wasn't mine without consulting you. His voice had become mechanical after repeating these words for 180 consecutive days. Sarah had been the last to arrive, carrying her cleaning uniform. Her apology was the longest and most detailed. Good morning, Mrs. Emily. I apologize for calling you a useless old woman. I apologize for suggesting you go sell flowers at the market. I apologize for celebrating when I thought you would be left homeless. I apologize for every look of contempt, every cruel comment, every moment I treated you as if you were less than human. Now, watching them work in the nursery, I felt a deep and complex satisfaction. It wasn't joy in their suffering, but rather a sense of cosmic balance finally restored. For 6 months, they had experienced exactly what I lived through for 25 years. Being ignored, being considered insignificant, being completely dependent on someone else's benevolence to survive. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rosalia, my accountant, who now officially handled all the financial operations for my 3 companies. Mrs. Emily, her cheerful voice said, I have excellent news. The contract with the international hotel chain has just been confirmed. They are going to renovate all the gardens of their properties in the country using our services. The total value of the contract is $1,200,000 spread over 2 years. Perfect, I replied, feeling my business empire continue to grow. And the projections for Green Distributors, even better. The new contracts with Costa Rica and Guatemala will allow us to expand into medicinal and aromatic plants. Conservative projections suggest additional annual profits of $800,000. After hanging up, I reviewed the monthly reports on my desk. Secret Gardens had grown by 40% since I took direct control of operations. Green Distributors had exceeded all expectations. Even the companies previously managed by Daniel and David were now more profitable under my direct administration. The irony was delicious. While they worked for minimum wage hauling soil and cleaning tools, I had transformed their old responsibilities into much more efficient and lucrative operations. Every client they had lost through negligence had returned. Every opportunity they had wasted was now generating substantial profits. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. It was Maria, who had been a secretary at the hardware store and was now my lead executive assistant. "Mrs. Emily," she said, entering with a folder, "David is asking for permission to speak with you. He says it's urgent." "Send him in," I replied, curious to know what could be so urgent as to interrupt his work schedule. David entered my office in his dirty work uniform, taking off his cap with exaggerated respect. 6 months of forced humility had completely changed his body language. He no longer walked with the arrogance of someone who believes they deserve everything. Now he moved with the caution of someone who knows they are completely dependent on the benevolence of others. "Mrs. Emily," he began in a trembling voice, "I've come to ask for a special favor." "Speak," I said without looking up from my documents. "Linda had complications with the pregnancy last night. She's in the hospital, and the doctors say she needs complete bed rest for the next 2 weeks. I need to be with her. I need to take care of her." His eyes filled with tears. "I'm begging you to give me permission to be off work until she's better." I looked up and studied him carefully. For 6 months I had watched as the reality of his new situation gradually transformed him. The arrogance had disappeared, replaced by genuine humility. The sense of entitlement had been replaced by gratitude for every small concession. "And how do you plan to make up for the lost work hours?" I asked. "I'll work double shifts when I get back," he replied immediately. "I'll work on Sundays." "I'll do whatever you ask to make up the lost time. I just need to be with my wife right now." The plea in his voice was genuine, but it didn't move me immediately. "Your contract clearly specifies that any unauthorized absence results in financial penalties," I reminded him. "I know," he murmured. "I accept the penalties. I accept any punishment you deem appropriate, but please allow me to be with Linda when she needs me." For the first time in 6 months, I saw something in David that I recognized as genuine growth. It wasn't just fear of the consequences or desperation to avoid punishment. It was the real understanding that his actions affected other people, that his decisions carried moral weight beyond personal gain. "All right," I said finally, "you can miss work to take care of Linda. But the lost hours will be deducted from your salary, and you will have to work extra shifts to compensate." The relief on his face was immediate and overwhelming. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Mrs. Emily." "You don't know what this means to me." "I know perfectly well," I replied. "It means you finally understand what it's like to depend on someone else's compassion. It means you've learned to value kindness when you receive it instead of considering it a right." David turned to leave, but he stopped and looked back. "Mrs. Emily," he said, his voice cracking, "I know I have no right to ask you this, but when Linda is better, when the baby is born, would there be any possibility of you reconsidering the terms of our contract? Not for me, but for them. So that my children can have a better future." The question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding for months. What was my ultimate goal? Was it simply to get revenge for years of humiliation, or was it to teach them valuable lessons that would make them better people? "We will talk about that when you have proven that you have truly changed," I replied. "When you can prove to me that you understand not only the consequences of your actions, but also the pain you caused me for all those years." David nodded and left my office. I was left alone contemplating the view from my window. Down below, Daniel was still carrying pots in the rain, but now I noticed something different in his posture. He no longer moved with the resentful anger of the first few months. There was an acceptance in his movements, an understanding that this was his reality now. Sarah appeared in my field of vision, carefully cleaning the gardening tools. For the first few months, she had worked with a contained fury, as if every movement were an act of silent rebellion. Now she worked with the meticulousness of someone who had learned to find dignity in a job well done, no matter how humble. My phone rang again. This time it was a journalist from a business magazine who wanted to interview me about the meteoric success of my companies. "Mrs. Emily," the reporter said, "your story is inspiring. A woman who built a business empire in secret while everyone thought she was just a housewife. What would you say was the most satisfying moment of your career?" I looked out the window again, watching the three people who had spent decades underestimating me as they now worked under my direct authority. "The most satisfying moment," I answered slowly, "was when I was finally able to teach certain people the true value of respect. Not the respect born of fear or need, but the respect that comes when someone finally understands they completely underestimated the person right in front of them." When I finished the interview, I leaned back in my executive chair and smiled. The rain had stopped outside, and a ray of sunlight illuminated the nursery, where my new extended family was learning lessons they should have learned decades ago. Power, I discovered, wasn't about humiliating others. It was about teaching them to value what they never knew they had. And after 6 months, I was finally seeing the first signs that my most difficult students were beginning to understand the lesson.